The inquiry chamber at Whitfield House smelled of tallow candles and cold stone. And on the morning Cecily Marlowe was brought before it, the fire had not yet been lit. She stood at the far end of a table long enough to see 12, and there were 9 men arranged along its length, some in the dark coats of government, one in the military dress of the Admiralty, and at the head of the table alone in a chair that sat slightly apart from the rest, a man whose face she had not seen before that morning. He had not looked up when she entered. He was reading, his dark head bowed, his hand flat on the surface of the table as though holding it still. The paper before him bore a broken seal in red wax, and she recognized it from 6 feet away, with a cold certainty that settled into her chest like snow into open water. She had copied that seal by hand. She had crouched at the writing desk in Lady Ashbourne's library at 10:30 at night, with a single candle burning down to its last inch, and she had rendered every curl and notch of it onto a page she had folded and pressed into the spine of her mother's old prayer book. And the prayer book was in her room, and she was here. And the man at the head of the table had still not looked up. He did, eventually. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of overcast sky above cold water, and they settled on her without expression and without hurry. And she had the sensation of being read, the way one reads a document whose full significance has not yet been determined. She was to the room nobody. She understood that. She had been nobody in that household for 3 years, and she expected to be nobody here. She had not yet understood that he was reading differently. Her name was Cecily Marlowe, and she had come to London from Wiltshire. At the age of 21, 2 months after her father died, her father, Thomas Marlowe, had served as private secretary to 3 different members of the nobility over the course of his working life, and had been a man of such scrupulous discretion that his employers had loved and ignored him in equal measure. When he died, he left Cecily a modest annuity, a house that belonged to the estate and must therefore be vacated, a library of books she could not carry, and a reference letter from the Earl of Henby so precisely worded in its praise that it communicated almost nothing to anyone who had not known him well. Lady Dorothea Ashbourne had hired Cecily on the strength of that letter and on the understanding that a secretary's daughter would know how to be useful without requiring management. What this meant in practice was that Cecily sorted the morning correspondence, read aloud in the afternoons, accompanied Lady Ashbourne to the dressmaker, wrote the replies to invitations that required no particular thought, and was expected to disappear between those tasks as thoroughly as a well-placed piece of furniture. She was good at disappearing. Well, she had been trained to it by a life spent watching her father vanish into his employer's world and return to their small house in the evenings, with ink-stained fingers and careful silence about everything he had witnessed. It was Lady Ashbourne herself who had named what Cecily was, in the way that women of her station named things when they wished to place them precisely. She had done it in the first week in the drawing-room, in a murmured aside to her visiting sister, that Cecily was not meant to hear, and that Cecily heard entire. "She is the secretary's girl," Lady Ashbourne had said, with a mild inflection that made the phrase both accurate and complete. "Her father worked for Henby. She is useful and she knows her place." Cecily had continued to arrange the flowers on the writing table, and had not altered her expression. She had known her place since she was small. The difficulty was that knowing one's place and agreeing with the assessment were not, in her experience, the same thing at all. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in November. It was among a stack of correspondence that the Morning Post had delivered to Ashbourne House, and it was addressed not to Lady Ashbourne but to Sir Rowland Fenwick, who was a baronet of some consequence in Portsmouth affairs and who had been a guest of the household for a fortnight while his own town residence was being refurnished. The letter had been placed with the household's mail in error, mixed in among 3 invitations and a bill from the draper. And it was Cecily who sorted the stack, and Cecily who saw, before she could stop herself from seeing it, that the letter had been opened and resealed. The red wax was smooth enough to the touch, but slightly wrong at the edge, the way a seam looks when it has been pressed back into place by someone in a hurry. She did not read it. She set it on the salver with Sir Rowland's other correspondence and carried it to his rooms herself, and she said nothing, and she noticed nothing aloud, and she told herself she had not seen what she had seen. It was the second letter that changed everything. She found it 3 days later, and she found it by accident, and she wished for the rest of that week that she had not. Sir Rowland had been using the library in the late evenings to write his own correspondence, which Lady Ashbourne permitted as a courtesy to a guest of his standing, and it was Cecily's habit to pass through the library each morning to ensure the fire had drawn properly and the writing table had been cleared. On the Thursday morning she found the library as she had found it every other morning, the ashes settled and the table tidy, except for a single sheet of paper that had slipped from the leather writing surface and come to rest half behind the brass coal scuttle, visible only from the angle at which she happened to be crouching to check the grate. She picked it up without thinking, the way one picks up anything that has fallen and should be restored to order. She saw the date, which was the previous evening. She saw the salutation, which was in French. She saw the seal impression at the foot of the page, where the writer had pressed his signet ring into the wax to mark the copy before sending the original. And her breath stopped, because she knew that seal. She had seen it on the missent letter. She had thought about it in the 3 days between and tried to set it aside, and now she was holding it in both hands in the cold library, with the morning light coming gray through the curtains, and she was reading it, and she wished she were not. She did not read all of it. She read enough. What she held was a copy of a dispatch, a copy someone had made for their own record. It described, in careful and specific French, the position of 3 naval frigates near the Straits, the expected sailing date of a 4th, and the name of the officer commanding the supply convoy that would precede them. The information was precise. The information was current. The information was the kind of thing a baronet with a seat near Portsmouth and connections to the naval establishment might come to possess, and it was on its way in some form to someone who should not have it. She stood in the library for a long moment. The fire was not lit. Her breath was visible in the cold air. Then she went to the writing desk, took a sheet of plain paper from the drawer, found the pen Sir Rowland had not returned to its case, and she copied. Not the letter itself, not word for word, but the seal. Every detail of the seal, the particular curling device at the center, and the initials worked into the border, and the small broken line at the lower left where the die had chipped at some point and left a gap no larger than a pin's head. She wrote down the date. She wrote down 3 words of the salutation in her own hand to identify the language and the character of the correspondence. Wend. She folded the paper into quarters, slid it into the spine of her prayer book where the binding had loosened at the back, and she replaced the prayer book on the shelf beside her bed where it had lived for 3 years, and where no one, in 3 years, had ever looked at it. She picked up Sir Rowland's fallen letter with 2 fingers, as though it had burned her. She placed it on the writing desk where it might have slid from. She walked downstairs and began the morning's work. She told no one. She was the secretary's girl. She had no one to tell. The inquiry arrived at Ashbourne House on a grey Monday in December, 3 weeks after the frigates had sailed, and 2 weeks after one of them had encountered an ambush in the Straits that should not have been possible, without prior knowledge of the route. Cecily read about the engagement in the Gazette that Lady Ashbourne received, and did not read, and she felt the cold of the library floor in November come back to her like a physical thing. The inquiry was led by Edward Cavendish, Viscount Northgate, who arrived with 3 assistants, a secretary of his own, and a manner that the household received as appropriate to the gravity of the occasion, which was to say that he did not smile, and he did not make conversation, and he moved through Ashbourne House as though he had already decided what he was looking for and was only verifying the location. He interviewed the senior members of the household first. He interviewed Lady Ashbourne herself for 40 minutes in the morning room, and Cecily, waiting in the corridor outside with the afternoon post she had been sent to retrieve and then instructed to hold, heard the murmur of Lady Ashbourne's voice and occasional silence where Cavendish spoke in a register too low to carry through the door. He interviewed Sir Rowland in the library for an hour. Sir Rowland emerged with his color high and his expression arranged into something that looked like righteous inconvenience, but sat, Cecily thought, rather closer to something else. When the footman came to tell her that Lord Northgate wished to speak with the junior members of the household, Cecily was in the passage outside the dining room, with the tray of correspondence she had been carrying for 20 minutes, while various instructions arrived and contradicted each other. She set the tray on the hall table and followed the footman to the small sitting room that had been designated for the inquiry's use, and she sat in the chair indicated, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the Viscount of Northgate across a writing table that was not wide enough to make the silence between them feel anything other than deliberate. He did not look up immediately. He was writing something, finishing a note, and she watched the movement of his pen and the particular controlled stillness of his face, which was not blank so much as stripped of everything that was not essential, the way a good piece of cabinet work looks before the ornament is applied. "Miss Marlowe," he said, and it was not a question and not a greeting but simply her name used to establish that he knew it. "Yes, my lord." "You sort the household correspondence." "I do, my lord." He looked up then, and she met his eyes, which were gray and steady, and assessed her with the same quality of attention she had noted in the inquiry chamber, a reading quality, a quality that did not assume and did not dismiss. "Tell me what you sort," he said. She told him she was careful and accurate, and she did not offer anything he had not asked for. He listened without interrupting, and at the end he said, "And the correspondence belonging to Sir Rowland." There was a half-second in which everything she had been holding for 3 weeks arranged itself in a particular pattern, and she chose carefully. "I placed Sir Rowland's correspondence on his salver with the household post, my lord. On the first morning, I noticed a letter in the stack that was addressed to him rather than to Lady Ashbourne. I brought it to his rooms directly." "Directly," he said. "Not through the footman." "No, my lord. He wrote something." Then he said, "If there is anything else you observed that you considered worth noting, I suggest you tell me." Now she understood, in that moment, that he already suspected something. Not her, not precisely, but something in the vicinity of everything she knew. She also understood that a woman of her position, saying what she knew, without the physical proof still folded into her prayer book, against a baronet of Sir Rowland's consequence, was a woman who would be managed out of the household and on to the next mail coach before the week was out. "I have observed a great deal, my lord," she said, keeping her voice level. "Some of it I am able to verify, and some of it I am not." He looked at her directly. "Sit down," he said. She had been sitting. She understood he meant something else by it, some instruction, to settle, to stay, to resist the impulse to make herself smaller. His eyes were entirely unreadable. His jaw was set with a tension she recognized as something controlled rather than something absent. She stayed. She said nothing further about what she had seen. She did not trust what would happen to the prayer book if she named it in that room, with the door not fully closed, and Sir Rowland still in the house. She should have known that Lord Northgate was already noticing. He had returned to the household's main rooms after speaking with Cecily, and had been in the corridor when a quarrel broke out below stairs about a missing document, the household accounts ledger which had disappeared from the desk where the butler kept it, and which had apparently been needed that morning for some routine purpose. The quarrel involved the butler, a senior footman named Griggs, and Lady Ashbourne's housekeeper, Mrs. Munbeam. Agnes Trott, who had a manner of quiet and absolute accuracy that Cecily had come to trust over 3 years, as one trusts a compass needle, because it always pointed to the truth regardless of the weather. Mrs. Trott was saying with precision that she had seen the ledger that morning at 7:30, that it had been on the desk at that hour, and that she had not moved it and could not account for its disappearance. Griggs was saying with increasing discomfort that he did not know what had become of it. The butler was suggesting, with the particular smoothness of someone passing a problem sideways, that Griggs had perhaps misplaced it in the course of his other duties. Cecily was passing through the corridor with a letter she had been asked to redirect. She heard the exchange. She stopped. Griggs did not take the ledger. She said it was not a sentence she had planned to speak. It arrived from somewhere below planning. He was in the hall from 7 until past 9. I had occasion to pass through several times, and he was present each time. Whatever happened to the ledger happened while he was there, and he could not have been responsible for it. There was a silence of the kind that happens when a piece of furniture speaks. Then, Lord Northgate, who had been standing at the turn of the corridor, and who had apparently witnessed the entire exchange from that position without anyone noticing, said, "Miss Marlowe." She looked at him. "Come inside," he said. and turned and walked into the morning room without waiting. And the certainty in the movement left no option except to follow. He stood at the window. The garden below was bare, the beds stripped back for winter, the gravel paths narrow and pale under the gray December light. He did not look at her for a moment. When he did, something in his face had shifted slightly. The controlled surface had not cracked, but there was something underneath it that pressed at the edges. A grief, or a recognition, or both at once. "You were not required to say that," he said. "It cost you something to say it." "Griggs did not take the ledger," she said again. "That is simply what is true." He was quiet. Then he said, "My brother was lost at the engagement at Porto-Velho 2 years ago. The Admiralty received intelligence about the French position 5 days before the action. It arrived correctly. It was not acted upon in time." He said it without inflection, the way one recites a fact that has been handled so many times its surface is worn smooth. "I have sat with that knowledge for 2 years. I have wondered, in the way one wonders at night, what it might have meant if someone had spoken sooner, or more clearly, or to a person who was prepared to listen." He did not look away from the window. The light was cold and flat, and fell across the sharp line of his jaw without softening it. "I am listening now," he said. "Whatever you know, Miss Marlowe. Whatever you are in a position to verify." She looked at his profile, and thought about the prayer book, and about the cold library floor, and about the particular sound of a seal pressed into hot wax. She thought about Griggs standing in the corridor, with his color high and his hands at his sides, being managed sideways into blame for something he had not done. She thought about her father, who had spent his professional life in rooms where the men with authority decided what the truth was, and the men without it absorbed the verdict, and who had told her once with the precision he applied to everything, that the only thing worth protecting absolutely was an accurate account. The thing itself, he had said, exactly as it was. Not the useful version, not the safe version. She was aware, in the cold morning room with the December garden bare below, that the Viscount of Northgate had told her something at genuine cost. A brother. 2 years. The intelligence that arrived correctly and was not acted upon. He had not explained why he was telling her this. He did not seem to require that she receive it as an explanation. It sat in the room between them as a fact that had finally found air. And she did not look away from it, because that would have been a form of dismissal. "I am not yet in a position to verify it safely," she said. "But I will be. Give me until morning." He turned from the window. Then he looked at her with the reading quality, and she had the sense that what he was reading had altered since he began, that the document was not what he had expected when he first opened it. He said nothing. He nodded once, and she left. The evening did not go as she had intended. She had meant to retrieve the prayer book from her room quietly, during the hour after supper when the household was engaged with its various evening arrangements and no particular account was taken of her movements. She was reaching for it on the shelf when she heard the footstep in the corridor, lighter than a servant's and more deliberate, and then the door opened. Sir Roland Fenwick stood in the doorway of her room. He was composed. He had always been composed, had always carried a kind of large-featured cordiality that worked. She now understood like a surface, over water, smooth above and dark below. He looked at her and then at the prayer book in her hand, and he smiled. And the smile had nothing warm in it. "I have been advised," he said pleasantly, "that the young woman who sorts the post found an unusual piece of correspondence in the library some weeks past." She did not speak. "The Viscount has been asking his questions," Sir Roland continued, "and some answers have come to me by means he did not intend. I know what you believe you saw. I know what you believe you may have recorded." His eyes went to the prayer book again. "I think you will find upon reflection that you saw nothing. You are, after all, the secretary's girl. A useful creature in a household that requires managing, but not precisely the sort of witness anyone attaches weight to." She said, "I think you should leave my room, Sir Roland." He looked at her for a moment with something she recognized as the calculation of a man deciding whether a thing is worth the effort. Then he said, "I will take that." and held out his hand. She did not give it to him. She said, "You may take it to whatever authority you choose. I encourage you to do so." He took it from her hand with a directness that did not require her to cooperate, the way a man of his size and station takes whatever he has decided to take, and then he was gone, and she stood in the cold room with her hands at her sides and the shelf where the prayer book had lived for 3 years empty above her. She had perhaps 15 minutes before he destroyed it. She sat at the edge of her bed, and she pressed her memory like a thumb against a bruise. The letter, the seal, the particular broken place at the lower left where the die had chipped. She had looked at it long enough that morning to copy it. She had looked at it long enough that she had told herself to look away, and had not. She took the sheet of paper from her writing case. She wrote what she remembered. Not the letter. She could not recapture the letter with any precision sufficient to be useful. But the seal she had made herself memorize. She wrote the description in a hand that did not shake, which required some effort, and at the foot of the description she wrote the details she thought mattered most, the details she had not included in the copy she had made because she had not yet understood what it signified. Her candle was low. She pressed her fingers together beneath the writing surface to keep them warm and thought about the morning in the library. The quality of the light at that hour, the way her eye had moved across the fallen paper and noticed the seal before she had consciously decided to notice it. She could see the image clearly. That was the thing she had not told anyone, not even Lord Northgate. She had a memory for this kind of visual detail that was almost involuntary, the same faculty that had made her useful to her father, who had sometimes asked her to read back a description he had written to test its accuracy against her recollection of the original. She had always been more accurate than the description. She had thought of it as a small and not particularly useful gift, the kind of thing that serves no purpose except to make one very precise about things no one cares to have precisely described. She cared now. The broken place at the lower left of the die was not a flaw in the casting. It was an absence. The die that had produced the seal on the first letter, the missent letter she had handled on the Tuesday, had that absence. The die that had produced the seal on the second letter, the copy she had found behind the coal scuttle, had produced the same absence, the same die, the same man. One letter passing through official channels, one letter going elsewhere. She wrote 2 paragraphs in a clear, close hand. She folded the paper, and she dressed, and she went downstairs, and she knocked at the door of the room that had been set aside for the Viscount of Northgate's use during the inquiry. It was past 11 o'clock at night. She was aware of precisely how far past the boundary of what was proper she was standing. He opened the door himself. He was still dressed, his coat on, a single candle burning on the table behind him. He looked at her face, and then at the paper in her hand. "Come inside," he said low and level. She did not, because propriety had to mean something even at the edge of an inquiry. She held the paper out to him from the doorway. "I cannot verify the letter itself," she said. "I could only describe the seal, but the seal matters because of this." She touched the paragraph she had written about the die. "One man, 2 dispatches. If you can examine Sir Roland's signet ring against the impression in the wax of the first letter, the one I brought to his rooms in November, you will find the same flaw in both. The die has a break at the lower left. It will be in the wax." He read the paper. He read it again. His face was still, but his eyes moved with the quality of a man who had spent his professional life reading documents and understanding what was not said in them, as well as what was. He looked up. "The prayer book," he said. He took it. His jaw tightened. A muscle moved above it, a small controlled thing. Then he said, "You should not have come here at this hour." "No," she said, "I should not. I am sorry for it. But I have told you what I know, and what I can prove, and what I cannot. And I would be grateful if you would hear the difference between those 2 things, because I do not expect to be believed without it." He held her gaze for a moment that was longer than the question required. Then he said, "I heard the difference 3 hours ago, Miss Marlowe. Go to bed. This will be addressed in the morning." She went. If she heard him leave the house 20 minutes later, she did not permit herself to wonder where he had gone or what he had taken with him when he went. The inquiry reconvened the following morning in the same chamber at Whitfield House where Cecily had first stood before 9 men and a cold fire, except that the fire was lit this time, and there were 11 men rather than 9, and Mr. Tullibers. Desmond Peel of His Majesty's Legal Service was present at the end of the table with a leather case that he opened, without comment, and set flat on the surface before him. Sir Rowland had arrived with his confidence intact. He had arrived, in fact, with an addition, which was that he had requested through Lady Ashbourne that an account be heard of certain improprieties on the part of the household's junior companion, specifically regarding the fabrication of evidence and the harassment of a guest. Lady Ashbourne had arrived beside him, her expression composed into the kind of regret that signals preparation for social surgery. Cecily was brought in last. She stood where she had stood before, at the far end of the table, and she folded her hands. She kept her face level, and she did not look at Lord Northgate, who was at the head of the table again, because she was not certain what she would see in his face, and she did not trust what the sight of it might do to her composure. Sir Rowland presented his account. He presented it with confidence and with considerable skill. The skill of a man who had spent years presenting versions of events to audiences who wanted to believe the version that did not require them to take action. He spoke of a document he characterized as a forgery, clearly written by an inexperienced hand, attempting to replicate a seal it had only glimpsed, produced by a young woman of no consequence, who had perhaps formed some misapprehension about correspondence she was not qualified to interpret. He did not use the phrase "the secretary's girl" himself. He did not need to. Lady Ashbourne, from her seat beside him, said it for him in a murmur to the woman next to her that was pitched to travel. One of the men at the table, an older gentleman from the Board of Trade who had not spoken before, said, quietly, to the man beside him, "The secretary's girl, is she? Well?" Cecily felt the floor of the room solidify under that sentence in a way it had not been solid before. Lord Northgate had been listening with his pen flat on the table and his hands still. When Sir Rowland finished, there was a silence of perhaps 10 seconds. Then Lord Northgate reached into the case, Mr. Ress. Peel had opened and withdrew an item, and placed it on the table, and she saw from where she stood that it was her prayer book. Sir Rowland's composure made a very small alteration, a fractional tightening around the eyes. "Sir Rowland," Lord Northgate said, "will you identify this article for the inquiry?" Sir Rowland said he had not seen it before. Lord Northgate opened the prayer book to the back and removed from the loosened spine a folded paper. He opened it. He read from it. He read the description Cecily had made in November, in the cold library, by candlelight, including the initials worked into the border and the broken place at the lower left of the die. He set it down. He then produced a second document, which was a wax impression taken Mr. Dentis. Peel told the room from the signet ring belonging to Sir Rowland, obtained under the legal authority of the inquiry by Lord Northgate personally on the previous evening. The room looked at both documents. The silence was of the kind that happens when a mechanism clicks into place, and everyone present understands that the mechanism will now run to its conclusion. Sir Rowland said, "A girl who spent 3 years sorting letters would know how to describe a seal convincingly." Lord Northgate looked at him for a moment. Then he rose from his chair, and he walked the length of the table, and he stopped beside Cecily, and he looked at the room with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand was not absence, but its opposite, a concentration held at such tension that it read as calm. "Miss Marlowe's testimony stands," he said. "I will answer for it myself." He said it once. He did not repeat it. He returned to his chair. Sir Rowland's composure completed its alteration over the next quarter of an hour, by increments that the room witnessed and that Mr. Menteith Peel recorded, and by the time the inquiry concluded, its formal portion, Lady Ashbourne had not said anything for 20 minutes, and her fan had been held at an angle low and still, that Cecily had never seen her hold it before. Miss Felicity Harrow, who had been seated beside Lady Ashbourne, had turned in her chair to watch Cecily at some point during the proceedings, and had not turned back. Cecily did not permit herself to feel anything about any of it until she was in the corridor. And then she permitted herself one moment, against the cold plaster wall with her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat at her sides, and then she opened her eyes and walked on. The days that followed arranged themselves around the inquiry's quiet conclusion. Sir Rowland was removed from the household. Mr. Peel came and went with documents. Lord Northgate remained at Whitfield House for 3 more days in his official capacity, and Cecily saw him twice in the corridors, and once across the breakfast table where the household still gathered in the mornings despite everything. And each time he looked at her in the reading way, the assessing way, and each time she looked back without dropping her gaze, because she had decided that if the Viscount of Northgate was going to read her, she was going to let herself be read and not apologize for having a legible face. On the 4th morning, snow fell. It had been threatening since the previous week, the sky holding its cold breath above the rooftops, and it came in the night while Cecily slept without dreaming for the first time in weeks, and when she woke, the light in her room was the particular white and diffuse quality that means accumulation outside the window. She lay still for a moment and listened to the quietness of a house muffled by snow, and felt something in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite ease, but was close to both. She was in the small morning room, the one at the back of the house that received the north light, when Mrs. Trott brought her tea and set it down with a care that was slightly different from ordinary care, and then did not leave. "Lord Northgate is in the hall," Mrs. Trott said. She said it with the precision she brought to all statements of fact, the compass needle pointing where it pointed. "He has asked to speak with you, if you are at liberty." Cecily looked at the snow outside the window. "I am at liberty," she said. He came in without ceremony and without preamble, as was his manner, and he stood by the door rather than crossing the room, which she understood as a form of respect for the kind of conversation he intended to have. He was in his traveling coat. He was about to leave. He held something out to her. It was the prayer book. She crossed the room and took it from him, and their fingers did not touch, though the margin between them was near enough that she was aware of the warmth of his hand before his hand was gone. She held the prayer book at her side and looked at him. "Mr. Peel has the formal copy of your description," he said. "The inquiry is satisfied. Sir Rowland will not be returning to any household's library." "I am glad," she said. He looked at her outside. The snow came down in small, steady flakes, and the garden was entirely white, except for the dark stems of the bare roses and the gray line of the stone wall at the far edge. "You said on the night you came to my door," he said, "that you did not expect to be believed without establishing what you could prove and what you could not." He paused. "I want you to know that the distinction you drew was one of the clearest pieces of witness I have received in 4 years of this work. Most people cannot make it. Most people believe that belief requires certainty, and so they overclaim or they say nothing." She thought about her father, who had spent his life knowing where the line between what he knew and what he supposed was drawn, and who had never once claimed to cross it when he had not. "My father taught me that," she said. He nodded. Then he said, Cecily, she had not expected him to use her name. It arrived the way unexpected things arrive in the cold, with a small shock of warmth. She looked at him, and he was looking at her with the reading quality, and she understood that he had read something and was choosing whether to say what it was. "I will be in London for some weeks yet," he said. "If you are willing to receive a caller—" She held the prayer book in both hands. She thought about her room upstairs. The empty shelf, the annuity that would support her but barely, the 3 years of making herself a piece of furniture in a house that had now become untenable. She thought about a man who had walked across an inquiry chamber because a woman's testimony needed answering for, and who had not made a speech about it but had simply stood beside her and said so. "I am willing," she said. The snow fell without hurrying outside the morning room window. The fire drew. He inclined his head in a way that was not quite a bow but held the bow's gravity, and then he left, and the room was as quiet as rooms are after someone has removed from them the quality that made them charged, and she stood for a moment holding the prayer book against her chest with both hands before setting it on the table beside her tea. She opened it. The copy she had made was still in the spine, folded into its quarters, exactly as she had left it. She looked at it for a moment. She looked at her own handwriting, the careful rendering of a seal she had crouched to copy by a guttering candle in a cold library, and she thought about the decision she had made in that moment. The decision to look rather than to pretend she had not seen. She had not been the secretary's girl in that moment. She had been herself. She closed the prayer book and left it on the table and went to the window, and the snow was settling into the garden in the steady, unhurried way of things that intend to stay. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. Mrs. Spray and Tay. Trot said something in the hall in the level voice she used for information. Worth noting, Cecily pressed one hand flat against the cold window glass and felt the winter through it distinct and real, and let it go. If this story moved you, I would love to know which moment stayed with you longest. Leave a word in the comments and come back when you are ready for another. The prayer book sat on the table behind her with a fire warm against its spine and the copy folded inside it, small and perfectly legible, a record of what she had seen and what she had chosen to do with the seeing. The snow went on falling. She stayed.